Hi, this is Tim Lightfellow again from Kingdom of Ontier in the SCA. I am going to attempt to discuss and then do another video actually showing cresting. It's a bit of a complicated subject, so I hope I cover all the important stuff and give a good example and demonstration that's helpful. So first off, what is cresting? Well, cresting is lines painted on arrows or crossbow bolts. That can be from as simple as a single line to, a line with a couple of other colored lines on it, like this orange with silver, this hornet or bee arrow, or this green and gold and black. Those are some arrow examples. On bolts, it tends to be a little bit smaller because they're shorter. So here are some examples for crossbow bolts. Again, from as simple as one or two colors, one color with a bunch of different patterns, including where it's in the fletching, to ones where it has a lot of paint both down below and in the fletching. The purpose of cresting is to, one, help things look prettier, and two, it helps us identify whose arrows or bolts are whose, because you can have 20, 30 or more people shooting at a line. If we all show up with period looking arrows that are bare shaft, gray fletches, we don't know whose are whose when we go to pull them from the target. This gives us identifying way to do that. One of the first things I recommend if you're going to be doing cresting is having some different lengths of wood that you can literally just use for testing. Sometimes I'm testing colors to see like which green or which red I like better for a pattern. Trying to work out if I have a couple different ideas, doing part with one idea, part with the other to figure out which one I think actually looks better in practice. So very useful if you have a broken arrow shaft, broken bolt that's long enough, you can use it for testing cresting patterns on. That way you can kind of work out the details, and like I was mentioning, you can see how it actually looks in practice, because sometimes when you try to translate what's in your head and what you see on it is perhaps not as impressive or not something you actually like. So it lets you work through it, modify it, get it to what you want before you put it on your bolts or arrows. So another thing, and I'll show this in the other video, is using a cresting jig. And the one I have is a spin right. I know there are a lot of different versions, including I've heard that there are some designs for like some Lego ones and that online. So if you buy one of the store brand ones like the spin right, you can be looking at well over $100 for them. The Lego ones, if you have the parts around, obviously can be done for inexpensive. So there are some options out there. There may even be plans for how to build one yourself out of wood with motors. I haven't looked that far, so I don't know. I want to be clear that what I'm sharing is the way I learned how to do it. There are lots of ways to do this. There's no one right way. For me, one thing that I've found is, and one thing you need to know is, what are you using for a sealant on your shaft? Because you need to make sure you have paint and sealant that will work together. I use an oil-based, it's called Daly's Profin for the sealant. And I've discovered that I was taught to use acrylic paints because they don't run at all with that sealant. I discovered that if you buy like an acrylic paint pen, they have additives to keep the acrylic paint liquid, and that does run with this sealant. Lesson learned. So first thing is making sure that you know that your sealant and your paints will work together. The next thing was a bit of just kind of trial and error and knowing other people in the area, including the person who taught me how to do cresting and how to make arrows. We had discovered through trial and error that you really, for most of the acrylic paints, need about 2 coats of Daly's Pro-Fin before you do the cresting. Otherwise, it can seep through and spread out in the wood. And especially if you're doing fine detail lines, it can really mess up the effect you're trying to get with the paint. And so again, knowing what your sealant does and how the paint interacts with it. So with the Daly's Pro-Fin, again, I use acrylics. Most of the time I'll just go to like Joann Fabric, one of the craft stores, and buy whatever brand they have. So some Deco Art, I have some Apple Barrel. I ordered off Amazon. I wasn't very happy with the silver I had, so I ordered some different silver, and this is Sargent Art acrylic. And I've also started buying some Angelus acrylic leather paints. The one thing I've discovered with the Angelus is it's very fluid. So it goes on fairly well. It coats pretty well. It dries actually fairly flat and smooth to the surface rather than sticking out like some of the other acrylics do. It also takes about 24 hours per coat to dry because there's so much liquid in it that has to dry off. One of the goals when doing cresting is to try and keep it fairly flat. It can be less of an issue with arrows, but for crossbow bolts, if you think about it, the whole shaft is touching the deck or the top of the crossbow. And so anything that changes the way the bolt sits, especially if it's inconsistent between bolts, can mess with the consistency of the shooting. So trying to keep the paint from being too built up and causing a big ridge is important. Some of the basics on doing the cresting. Again, for me with acrylics, trying to make sure that the acrylic has enough fluid in it to spread well without overdoing it and having it spread really, really well. Making sure not to push the paintbrush really hard against the shaft when it's spinning. So you're looking for a really light touch. You're barely moving it in until you see the paint starting to show on the shaft. Because if you just push it right up against the shaft, what you do is you tend to push all the paint out to the edges. And so then you have ridges of paint at the edges and little or no paint in the middle. You end up doing a bunch of coats trying to fill that in. And that's a touch and feel kind of thing. I hope I'm explaining it well so you can understand what I'm saying, but that's practice is really what's going to help the most. I still have times where it's like, oh shoot, I just, put too much pressure. With acrylics, I have a little bit of an advantage in that if I keep a wet cloth, I can wipe it off as long as I do it right away. So if I really mess up, I can wipe it off and let it dry and start again. Okay, so I can actually show you this. So this is my cresting jig. I've got an added on ruler here. And what that does is it gives me a nice gauge I can use for patterns. The other way people tend to do patterns is a piece of paper with the pattern drawn out on it, so you can measure it, put the lines where you want, and then use that. I've done it that way, obviously. That's my pattern. Actually, that's my pattern for the green, gold, and black arrow I showed you earlier. I struggle a little bit with that. I find that I'm doing a lot better having this as a guide, because literally as I set my hand down with the paintbrush, I can line it up, the paintbrush, with the numbers on this. It's easier than trying to line up with this. And as I've mentioned in the arrow straightening videos I've done, I have an astigmatism in each eye that affects the way I see things. So if I get a slightly different angle, it'll look more than slightly different. So to give me a benefit, I put this on so I can use those numbers. So having a pattern to work off of one way or the other is very useful if you want a consistency between arrows or bolts. I'm not putting too much pressure on the paintbrush. Thinking through the pattern colors, a lot of people, it's maybe their device colors or their badge colors or just their favorite colors. So for instance, this black and white was a test to see what pattern I liked for someone whose device was literally argent and sable counterchanged. So black and white arrow, black and white fletch. You can be as creative as you want. There are no hard and fast rules about colors, designs. I will say one thing that I've discovered is how much difference having colored lines in it makes compared to just having the base color. It's kind of surprising when I'm doing a set and I lay out the base colors and I may be looking at it and thinking, it's okay. It's not quite what I was hoping for. Then I go in and start putting in those detail lines. It's like, oh, there's what I was looking for. So it can really definitely make that pattern just that much more interesting and make me that much happier about what you've done. I think that covers most of it as far as the talking part. I'm going to have to reset things to get an angle with the camera so I can show actually doing some of the cresting. So I'll do that in a separate video. If you have any questions, feel free to ping me on Facebook, send me emails. I am currently the chief archer for the Barony of Wywood, so you can get me through that email address. Otherwise, my email address is lightfellow@geigercomputers.com. Thanks, and have a good day.